you don't get happy by trying to be happy. You get happy by trying to be excellent. A byproduct of achieving human excellence is happiness. And there are a lot of things in life where you can't target them directly. If you live your life in the right way, one of the byproducts is this other thing that you can't achieve directly except maybe by taking drugs.
Hey everybody, I'm Zale Mednick, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. Every decision you've ever made came with a shadow version. The path you didn't take, the choice you almost made, the life that could have been, the partner that was almost the one, the career path you almost took. We call that counterfactual thinking, and most of us do it constantly without ever questioning whether it's helping us or quietly making us miserable. I'm joined by Barry Schwartz. Barry's an emeritus professor of psychology at Swarthmore College and a research associate at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. He spent more than 50 years thinking and writing about the interaction between economics, psychology, and morality. He's written several books that address aspects of this interaction, including The Battle for Human Nature, The Cost of Living, The Paradox of Choice, Practical Wisdom, Why We Work, and most recently, Choosing Wisely. Schwartz has spoken 4 times at the TED Conference, and his TED Talks have been viewed by more than 25 million people. Barry, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Very good topic.
I guess this really is a feature that is related to all of the books you've written in a sense, because you're talking about choice. And when we talk about choice, a lot of us tend to then think about the other choices that were possibly there. What got you into this field of work?
Well, actually, this is a longer story than you might expect. I've spent a lot of my time working on arguments, and I wrote 2 books about this, that our enthusiasm for the free market as a society is a very mixed blessing. That, aside from things like inequality, when you rely on markets to provide things that people want and need, it does bad things to the structure of the society in which people live. That's a price you pay. And I wrote a couple of books, one book called The Costs of Living, which is all about how when we marketize things, we make them less good. The counter argument that I would get when I made these arguments is that, yeah, markets have their problems, but the one good thing is that markets cater to freedom. Nobody is telling us what toothpaste to use, what restaurants to eat in, where to go on vacation, anything. We are free to choose, and that's the hallmark of American society, and it's worth whatever the price we pay for relying on markets to be able to have this kind of freedom. And I would shrug my shoulders and go, I guess maybe you're right. And then a paper came out, the famous JAM study, which I made famous. I didn't do the study, but, it was a study where at a fancy food store, one day, whenever they have a new product, they put the product out on a display table and people can come and sample it. And it was this fancy jam from England. And one day they put out on this display table 30 different flavors of this jam. And a few days later, they put out 6 flavors of the jam. And what they found is that more people were attracted to the display when there were 30, but 1/10 as many people actually bought jam.
Wow.
1/10. And this is so counterintuitive, because if you don't care about 30 options, you can ignore most of them. So you have to be better off with 30 options than you are with 6. And yet somehow people can't pull the trigger and they walk away without jam. So this was my window into how even when it comes to catering to freedom of choice, markets can have bad effects because choice is not an unmitigated good. There can be too much of a good thing. And when there is, people suffer. And that led ultimately to the paradox of choice and to my own research. So it's a more complicated story probably than you might have expected.
I think
But
that's
why I've been interested in it.
I think that's a very telling story, and I find choice overwhelming. And I've done a couple podcasts over the years regarding choices, and I was speaking to somebody recently, and I just said, I am so overwhelmed by the choice in this world, by the endless choice in this world. And I know that it's a good thing, and I know that if I was able to kind of surpass some of the limitations of the human condition that make me hesitant when I have so many choices. Like you said, if there's 30 cheeses in front of me, I'm less likely to choose or 30 jams in front of me, I'm less likely to choose any jam because too much choice can lead to choice paralysis. If I were able to get past that, then that would be a great thing. But I also acknowledge that sometimes I just can't. And I've wondered if in our society where ideas and products are proliferating at such a quick pace, whether this is a net good or whether, as you mentioned, this is leading to net suffering, having more choice, or as I imagine you're going to say, it depends on the situation and it depends on the person.
But yes, that both of those are true. The critical thing to appreciate is that it does have negative effects. And then all of a sudden, should I add options becomes a sort of an empirical question. Will adding options make people better off? Will it make me better off? And the answer is not automatically yes. More options is always better than fewer. And now you have to do the hard work of figuring out for you, or if you're a marketer for the product that you're developing, how many options is actually going to liberate people without paralyzing them. And since there isn't like an official government view about how many options to provide, every person and every producer, seller makes their own decision. And the result is, though no one intends it, that we are now all overwhelmed with the number of options there are. It's not just you. I got, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of emails over the years where the substance of the email was, I thought I was the only one who had this problem. I thought there was something wrong with me. Thank you so much for showing me that this was a problem that a lot of people have. So, I tend not to have this problem, partly because I'm pretty happy generally choosing the same thing tomorrow that I chose today, if I like what happened with the choice I made today. So I'm not out to get the best experience possible. So it's never been a problem for me. But even when my wife and I sit down at the end of the day and to watch something on Netflix, we'll scroll through the options for about a half hour and then throw up our hands in disgust, turn off the television and read a book.
Yeah. Which is a very common, relatable thing that a lot of people experience, which I experienced a few weeks ago. In fact, I'm revising
this book, The Paradox of Choice, with a former student of mine now, not because the claims in the book have proven false, but because the problem that I wrote about in 2005 is much worse now than it was in 2005.
And we're going to get to some of that in terms of how social media has really influenced the game here about what we're talking about. Barry, one of the things that spawned the idea of this episode of Counterfactuals for me wasn't really so much related to the idea of what am I going to watch, what am I going to buy, which is super fascinating and is very relevant to our lives. what got me thinking about it was more the idea of regret, and regret about things that, at least to me, and I imagine to most people, are less trivial. Things about the choices I've made in my life, the career I've chosen, the decision whether or not to have kids. These are the kinds of decisions that you can make in your life and then look back on and say, I am now on a certain path dictated by those choices. I cannot go back and change them. And what if I had lived a life where choices A and B were different? And that really gets to this idea of counterfactuals. And I hadn't realized for a long time that counterfactuals was even a word. I was just thinking in these kind of lines. Talk to me a little bit about what a counterfactual is, and then maybe we can get back to relating that to the struggle that some people might have about getting stuck with, what if I had done this? What if I had done that?
Sure. So a counterfactual is just a fancy word for contrary to fact. You know, if it rains today, I'll go to the movies. It doesn't rain. What do I do? So if it rained today, I would have gone to the movies. But it didn't rain. But the sentence, if it rained today, I would have gone to the movies, is stating a state of affairs that's against fact. And so it's a critical tool that we have that helps us understand how the world works. This is the way experimental science operates. If you take oxygen out of the environment, what happens to a flame? Well, there is no environment without oxygen, but you can pump the oxygen out of the environment and see what happens to a flame. And by creating these counterfactual conditions, you learn something about the role of oxygen in feeding fire. So every experiment creates a set of conditions that is a counterfactual with respect to the world. You take something complicated and you make it simpler so you can understand it better in a laboratory than you can in the real world. And then you build back up from that laboratory demonstration to get an understanding of whatever the phenomenon is that you're interested in. So it's an unbelievable tool for helping us understand the world and understand ourselves. What kind of a person am I is a question that many of us are asking all the time. And one way to get an answer is to imagine what you would have done if something different had happened in your life. If I had gone to University of Pennsylvania instead of New York University, what trajectory would my life have taken? And you can't be certain that when you ask yourself questions like this, you really will get a deeper understanding of who you are. That is to say, you could be wrong, but it still enables you to get a better sense of who you are than simply playing back the tape of your life and using that as to tell you everything there is to know about who you are. It isn't just what you actually did do. It's also what you might have done under somewhat different circumstances. That paints the full picture. So in the case of choice, anytime you make a choice, you could have made a different one, which means that every time you make a choice, you are creating a situation that is full of counterfactuals. And what you do about that is a key question. They can be enlightening, or they can be paralyzing. And I think in the case of regret, it really shows you how paralyzing choice can be, because it's very hard to avoid regretting decisions. And the one way you can avoid regretting decisions is by not making them.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that may be the only way you can avoid regretting decisions. So, it helps you understand what your marriage should be doing, what you hope it will be doing, to ask yourself how your life would have been different if you hadn't made this commitment. I made this particular commitment almost 60 years ago. And, I must say I've stopped imagining what my life would have been like if I hadn't made the decision. But at various points along this 60-year path that my wife and I have been on, each of us has asked ourselves that question in one way or another.
I'm a little surprised, perhaps naively, about one aspect of that answer, and that's the utility of the counterfactual that you're suggesting. And that if I do look back and not necessarily ruminate, but think about what if I had made that choice, that's productive for me. Because I've found, and maybe this is just specific to me and the way my mind works, that when I look back and think about the different choices I can make, it can be unproductive. Because what it's doing is, it's not, from my standpoint, I've always sensed that it isn't necessarily teaching me about myself, but I often find I idealize certain other paths that I could have taken, whereas perhaps I'd be better served if I just said, but you didn't make those choices. This is the life you live. And it's a fine balance, because if it's going to influence future choices you make, and if there is a choice that you made 15, 20 years ago that you wish you hadn't made, that you can not reverse, but that there's still room to change course, then that's one thing. But if it's a choice where you can't reverse it, like I went to UPenn and I should have accepted Harvard if only I had that problem, then you can't really go back and change that.
No. And the reason I emphasized its productivity is that I think the most obvious thing about it is how unproductive it is to think about counterfactuals. In fact, people think it's unproductive to regret decisions. And so, the thing to do is to eliminate regret from your emotional vocabulary. And I think that's a terrible idea. I think regret is really an important emotion. It sort of takes decisions we've made and puts them in boldface and italics so that we won't do the same thing again if similar circumstances arise. Everybody does many things in life that are regrettable, and it is good that we regret them. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it can also be paralyzing, and it can also take what's good in a decision and eliminate it. If you spend all your time thinking about what you've passed up, there's almost no decision that's good enough to survive contemplating all the things you might have done instead. I think the obvious response people have to it is, regret's bad. I'm going to teach myself not to look backwards. And I think a lot of us can benefit from looking backwards less than we do. But I think we also need to appreciate what it adds to our understanding of ourselves and the decisions we've made and the relations we have with people, to experience this regret and maybe have it alter our behavior going forward. There's a lovely study that was done years ago by a social psychologist named Tom Gilovich. And he was interested in whether people regret more things they do that they shouldn't have done, or things they don't do that they should have done. So is regret of omission as powerful as regret of commission? And here's what he found. In the short run, it is much more painful to do something that doesn't work out than it is not to do something that might have worked out. But in the long run, when you ask people, looking back on your life, what are the things you most regret? Almost all the things people list are things they didn't do that they could have done. And so over the long haul, it's failing to do things we could have done that seems to bother us most. Regrets of omission, failing to act when we had an opportunity to take advantage of something. So I think it's an interesting, complicated emotion, regret. And there's no way I know that you can avoid having more experiences of regret as the options you face in life grow. And that can be trivial things like where should I eat, what restaurant should I eat in tonight? And non-trivial things like which job should I take or which job should I have taken? Should I get married? Should I have children? The really big ones. Yes, they're often not reversible, and all that means is that it makes them more potent. But I do think that counterfactual thinking is an enormously useful tool to prevent us from making the same mistakes in the future that we made in the past.
By reflection.
But it does have the downside that can also get us to value decisions we've made less than we should, or to regard decisions we've made as mistakes when in fact they weren't mistakes. So, as somebody once said in a book that sold about 1 trillion copies, his first sentence of the book was, "Life is hard." And I guess you might say after that, all the rest is commentary. Life is hard.
I like that, and I don't disagree. And I think it's refreshing hearing you validate the notion of regret, the idea that it is okay to not just reframe regret as, well, it's not a regret because it taught me what I now know. It's not a regret because I wouldn't have been who I am today if that hadn't happened. Now, you can still have that, but why not accept, yeah, I would have done things a little bit differently? Why are we so averse to accepting regret? Why is it a common adage to no regrets as a toast? Regret is this negative thing that you are supposed to avoid and take out of the narrative of your life.
No. And I understand why people have that attitude. And in a rich society where choices proliferate, you can see encouraging people never look backwards, only look forwards, see what the world is offering you and have at it, But, all of this ignores that you can become better and better at making decisions as a result of paying attention to how your decisions in the past have worked out. And if you don't think about how your decisions in the past have worked out, well, then you get to a situation where you just make the same damn mistake over and over again. That hardly strikes me as a good strategy for living a good and valuable life.
I want to get back to that study you mentioned, that in the short run, it's much more painful to do something that doesn't work out. But in the long run, people look back on their lives and they're always saying, I wish I had done that, which doesn't necessarily surprise me. I want to put that in the context of one of the choices we've mentioned a couple of times, which is the decision of, do I want kids or not? I have 2 kids right now, for example. And
You make that sound temporary. Can you still return them?
I've thought about it. As we all have. When we're debating whether we want a 3rd kid or not, a common thing we'll hear from people is, who have 3 kids, granted, you won't regret having a 3rd kid. But I think it's a reflection of exactly what you said. It was sitting on your deathbed. You will never regret having had a 3rd kid. And for the most part, people will love their children, and there's very few things that could potentially replace the love of a child. What I think it misses, though, is what are you giving up in order to have that 3rd kid, or in order to have those kids in general? And it comes back to the status quo. And in regards to kids, the status quo is kids provide meaning. Few things can provide meaning like that. Why would you not do it if you can? But we don't talk about the hundreds of books you could have read if you didn't have those kids, the movies you could have watched, the trips you could have taken, and the things that we do ascribe value to in life take a second seat by a long shot to having kids. Curious what you think of the counterfactual there, in terms of, what if I had kids? What if I didn't have kids? And how the complications of choice and societal expectations influence some of that.
Well, this is in some ways the biggest decision any of us faces. But when my wife and I were married almost 60 years ago, it was neither one of us ever thought this was a matter of choice.
Mm-hmm.
It was simply what you did. When you became an adult, you got married and you had a family. Now, of course, we knew that there was no compulsion, but it was so much the norm and so much the life path that everybody we knew followed, that childless couples, we always assumed, were childless because they couldn't have kids, not because they chose not to. So it really, in an important psychological sense, was not a matter of choice. Nowadays, at least again in societies like the U.S., it is very much a matter of choice, and people are making the choice, and increasingly making the choice not to have kids, and because what looms large for them is all that having kids will force them to give up, and the counterfactual of, living your life not having had kids, and then on your deathbed saying, my God, how could I have made such a terrible mistake? Doesn't loom nearly as large at the moment when you're making decisions as I can't socialize with friends. I can't take vacations whenever I want. I can't see the movies I want. I can't read all the books I want. I can't get as far in my career as yada, yada. I mean, the sacrifices are long. There's a long list, and they're kind of obvious. And if it's a matter of choice, people are going to choose no. When it's not a matter of choice, effectively, then people aren't going to choose no because they don't think it's a choice. It's what you do, So I don't know, if I were if I were your age and starting out in life, what my attitude would have been about having kids. And it's conceivable, at any rate, that my attitude would have been, listen, people make different choices. we got to decide, and we might have decided we both were interested in the work we did, somewhat ambitious about making an impact with the work that we did. It's not inconceivable to me that we would have decided not to have a family. So there are certain decisions that are so big that we rely on something outside ourselves to make them for us. And that something outside ourselves is often strong social norms, strong expectations about what life is supposed to look like, and so on. I knew somebody who was on the faculty at Princeton who was completely paralyzed when it came to making decisions like, what sweater should I buy? And she had kids only because she never viewed that as a matter of choice. If she had devoted the kind of thought to having kids or not as she did to deciding whether to buy a sweater, she said to me, I never would have had kids.
Do you think that people in general were happier when we didn't have as much freedom to make these choices? And that sounds like a anti-progressive question, because of course we want to have as much choice as possible. We believe in freedom, but would people be happier if the counterfactuals they were considering were things as mundane as, should I have worn that sweater yesterday, as opposed to, should I have taken this whole path in life that I chose that was one of many potential paths? Are humans still better when there is a path forward that is prescribed for us?
I think the answer to that, and I wrote a paper about this with a psychologist named Adam Grant some years ago. I think that choice within constraint is ideal, and no choice and unconstrained choice, the two extremes, are virtually impossible situations for people to survive with. If everything is on the table, it's almost impossible to live a coherent, meaningful life. If nothing is on the table, it is impossible to live a coherent, meaningful life. So there's a sweet spot. And the sweet spot is itself something that is hard to determine and will vary from person to person and from time to time, no doubt. But ignoring that more of something doesn't make it better is, I think, one of the reasons why the rates of depression and anxiety in modern affluent society is so high, because we are essentially telling our kids everything is possible. Go choose.
And the stakes are higher. We're not talking about what do you want for dinner tonight or what outfit
That's
do you want to
correct.
wear.
The stakes are much higher. What should I study? Where should I live? Should I go to college? Should I form a romantic partnership? On and on. Increasingly, what's my sexuality? There's almost no aspect of life that is not now regarded, at least in liberal circles, as a matter of choice. Everything's on the table. You have this massive a la carte menu. Now go choose. And that's I don't think people can live in a world like that. Although most people will tell you they want to live in a world just like that. And then they discover that when you give them that world, they just are completely paralyzed, second guessing themselves, afraid they're missing out on good things, and social media just takes the problem and magnifies it, because now it is so easy for us to see what everyone else on the planet is doing. So you get smacked in the face all the time with all the things you could have been doing that you aren't. in a way that wasn't true, 50 years ago, and certainly wasn't true a century ago.
Social media just seems to amplify everything we're talking about to the nth degree.
It does.
One of my favorite quotes, comparison is the enemy of happiness. And I've felt that in my life for many years, comparing my present self to previous versions of myself, or more commonly, especially with social media, comparing myself to others, my life choices to the choices of others, let alone acknowledging that what I'm seeing on social media is a curated narrative. It's not even the truth. But nonetheless, it's hard to always realize that in the moment when you're seeing something on social media. What's your advice to people about social media? Because you've looked at this and how this has not only heightened the problem that we have with paradox of choice, but the problem of comparison and counterfactuals.
Right. So here too, we've got a blessing and a curse rolled into the same thing. You know, social comparison is an essential ingredient if we're going to get through the day, let alone a life. How do you evaluate what you're doing? Well, it's very helpful to evaluate what you're doing and the decisions you're making by comparing yourself to relevant others. It's a source of information to help you, get feedback on whether you're making good decisions or not, choosing good paths or not. But it's also the curse that anytime you do compare yourself to someone else and that someone else seems to be doing better than you feel like you're a failure. And perfectly good decisions leading to perfectly good outcomes stop feeling like they're all that good if you look around you and see other people seemingly having more fun or being more successful. So you want the right amount of social comparison and you want people to make it in the right way and draw the right conclusions. But there's no guarantee that you'll always do it right. And it was self-limiting pre-social media because there were only so many people we interacted with on a given day. There were only so many comparisons we could make. So if we had a tendency to basically compare, the world set limits on how much comparison we would do. Well, those limits are now gone. And you're right. What we see on social media is curated. And we know that it's curated. And it doesn't stop us from thinking that everyone we know is living a better life than we are. And this, I think, is especially true, at the stage in life where people are most attracted to social media, which is, adolescence to young adulthood. Eventually, you come to see it as a curse, and you swear off social media to some degree. But when you're, sort of 15 to 25, you're a slave to social media. And I see it as, a little bit informative and enormously destructive.
There's a concept of maximizers, people who need to make the best possible choice, and satisfiers who settle for good enough. One of the most useful pieces of advice I once picked up was the notion that good enough is okay, and that settling is not always a bad thing. Whether it's related to your career, whether it's related to the university you went to, whether it's related to the spouse that you ended up with. And I just found that, again, liberating. The idea that society, as it's been increasingly liberalized, it's also been further romanticized that anything is possible, but it makes it impossible it makes the level of happiness infinite, and it's impossible to reach it. And for me, accepting that good enough is okay was a very, very comforting feeling. you make about maximizers and satisfiers?
In some ways, the central message of the book I wrote, The Paradox of Choice, is exactly that. My colleagues and I developed this tool for measuring whether people differ from one another and how inclined they are to be maximizers, to be looking for the best. And the choice problem is really not such a problem if you are looking for good enough. And the reason is that it doesn't matter how many movies Netflix makes available to you. If you're looking at the screen until you find one that's good enough, as soon as you find one that's good enough, you'll stop looking. The problem comes when you stop thinking good enough is good enough, because now you sort of have to keep looking until you found the best. And the only way to know you found the best is to look at all of them. And if you look at all of them, you won't have any time left in the day to watch any of them. So I think that the choice problem essentially stops being a problem if people can adopt the idea that the goal in life should be good enough decisions. And that's true of big things like jobs and spouses, and little things like restaurants and TV shows to stream. It is hard to force yourself to adopt the good enough standard. You know, there's a sense in which people say to themselves, listen, I'm lucky enough to have been born in as a privileged member of an affluent society where anything is possible, and here I am settling for good enough. Shame on me. I should be more ambitious. And in fact, settle is an interesting word. Do you think if I describe you as settling, that's a neutral description?
No, it's a negative description, and that's why it took me personally so many years to at least intellectually get to the point of I'm okay to settle, even though it's harder to actually embody that philosophy day to day when you see most people in society not espousing what you're saying, but espousing achieve your best self, self-help books, you can do better, you can be happier. That's the message.
Yep. Somebody says, oh, he settled for A, B, or C. What they're really saying is he just settled for A, B, or C. He could have done better. He should have done better, but he just settled. So it's sort of like looking a gift horse in the mouth. Here you are in the midst of plenty, and you settle for good enough. And I think this is the single most important thing people can do to survive in the world as it currently is to establish good enough as the operative standard without saying what good enough means. You can have high standards in some parts of your life and lower standards in others. But the point is that you will acknowledge this is good enough. And then as soon as you find something that meets that standard, you stop looking. And that means you don't look around after you've chosen to see whether you've passed up something better. And it means you're not paralyzed with indecision until you've looked at enough options to know that the one you've chosen is a good one. Very difficult for people who are not already oriented in this way. It's very difficult to convince them that their lives would be better if they settled more and maximized less. But it's true.
Yeah. I have OCD, which I've spoken about on the show a few times before, and that I'm certain, one of the few things I'm certain about, colors my perspective on this topic, because a big element of obsessive compulsive disorder is an obsessiveness over perfectionism and intolerance of doubt and uncertainty. And for me, I've often said something like religion would have been a really, really good thing for me. And
That's
I'm
just what I
Jewish.
was thinking. You need to
Yeah.
join an Orthodox community.
That tells me exactly. I've said I am Jewish. Unfortunately, sometimes I say I don't believe in the tenets of religion. And if I did, though, and it had this template for life for me to follow, it would take out so much choice. And what I'm gathering from our conversation is that so much of what we're talking is actually related to institutions. The guardrails against counterfactualism and too much choice are, to an extent, what institutions are in place. If you are living in a world that is completely right-wing, typical conservative, that's probably too far, most of us would agree. If you're living in a complete left-wing anarchist society where there is no order and the idea is absolutely anything is possible and there can be chaos at any point because you should be making changes to optimize your happiness. Those are two different institutional perspectives which shape the way we think about choice.
That's exactly right. There are, the parameters that you just laid out vary a lot from one culture to another. The standards, but in Western democratic rich societies, the norm is a lot closer to anarchism than it is to orthodoxy. So, the libertarian model is a model where you have a gigantic buffet table laid out in front of you, and your job is to go through it and choose. And nothing constrains you, and you get to be the person you want to be, unshackled. And I think that model has always been deeply defective because it fails to appreciate that this liberating aspect of being able to choose is liberating only because there are constraints. And the choices you have are not limitless, they're limited, but they're limited in the right way. And one argument you could make about how societies have progressed in the last until recently, in the last 150 years, is that a lot of things that were not on the table but should have been are now on the table. What kind of romantic attachments you form, when you form them, what shape they take. All of those things are matters of choice to a much larger degree than they were a century ago. And for a lot of people, that's a good thing because the model that society had was one that we didn't feel like we should conform to, but we really had no choice. Now we do. And so lives have gotten a lot better for a lot of people as a result of relaxing those kinds of constraints. But the relaxing of those constraints has also made it harder for almost all people to figure out what they should do and then not beat themselves up having made a decision that maybe they made the wrong decision. So, and by the way, let me also say, this is not unrelated, I don't think. It's a foreign idea to think the goal in life is to be happy. It's not a foreign idea for people living in the 21st century in places like the U.S. It's the point, but it wasn't the point. The point was to live a life where you do what you are supposed to do, whatever that might mean. And happiness was beside the point. If I had asked my grandparents if they were happy, they would have looked at me like I was asking them a question in a foreign language. It's like, what does happiness have to do with anything?
And I wonder, Barry, if your grandparents, I don't know any of your history, obviously, but people of that vintage, will say, may have actually been objectively happier than a lot of people today because they weren't thinking about happiness, because happiness wasn't the goal.
And this is what Aristotle thought, that the thing about happiness is that happiness is attained indirectly. You don't get happy by trying to be happy. You get happy by trying to be excellent in the various tasks that are appropriate for you to be undertaking in your life. A byproduct of achieving human excellence is happiness. And there are a lot of things in life where you can't target them directly. If you live your life in the right way, one of the byproducts is this other thing that you can't achieve directly, except maybe by taking drugs. But so there are constraints, institutional constraints, cultural constraints, religious constraints, within which people felt free enough to create their own path, not so free that they had no idea what path to even consider, and not so constrained that almost everything they were interested in was foreclosed to them. And we have taken the positive value of constraints completely for granted and knocked them aside wherever we could, thinking that by doing so, we were going to make some people better off and we weren't going to make anybody worse off. And yes, it did make some people better off, but it also made some people worse off.
Absolutely. I think people can relate to the things you're saying in this podcast, whether it's about that 30 minutes looking for something on Netflix and ending up shutting the TV, or spending their whole lives searching for some form of happiness and regretting the choices they've made. Especially your point about happiness not being the goal is so profound. I mean, happiness to me is just, it's one element of the human experience. Sadness is an element of the human experience. Guilt, regret, laughter, nostalgia, all of these things are core human emotions and experiences. But let's just say for the last many years, happiness is the one that has been put on this pedestal, understandably, because it can feel very good. But we do need to question, since we've put happiness on that pedestal, has happiness even improved?
Right. And, and there's also a deep question about what it means to say that you or someone is happy. Aristotle, again, who thought that, what he called eudaimonic happiness is the goal in life, thought that pleasure, happiness as pleasure, was just a distortion of what happiness ought to mean. And so increasingly, I think, we think the yellow smiley face captures what happiness means. And if that's what you're looking for, well, even if you find it, you're not actually going to be happy in the right way. But all of this liberation has just meant enormous progress. I'm old enough that the women who were one generation older than me, my mother, my aunts, they were unbelievably constrained with respect to how they were going to live their lives. None of them had any aspirations for anything other than raising a family. And maybe that was the right thing for them to do, but they didn't think there were options. You took a job to be able to pay your bills, but the idea was to quit that job as soon as you could and become a mom. Well, that's the right decision for some people. It's not the right decision for everyone, and it wasn't a decision for any of my aunts. It was simply the way the world is. So, women have been enormously enriched by the liberation that has occurred, and the society has been enormously enriched by having women playing major roles in more and more aspects of life. All that is good. But that doesn't take away from the problem that when all of the constraints are removed, all of a sudden people wake up paralyzed. this is not doing them a favor, and it's not doing the society a favor. I don't know what constraints are the ones that are beneficial. I just know that there have to be some constraints. And when we break down many of them in the name of justice, we need to be careful that we're not breaking down all of them. And, probably these are decisions that societies should make as societies. And there won't ever be complete agreement about what the guardrails should be, and nor will it be constant. They'll change. But the notion that guardrails are a good thing at least has us asking, what should the guardrails be? Rather than assuming that they're a bad thing and taking every opportunity we can to knock them down.
Barry Schwartz, thank you so much for joining me. You can find Barry's books on Amazon. Really just Google them, The Costs of Living, The Paradox of Choice, and most recently, Choose Wisely, in addition to several other books. Barry, is there some place you want to direct our listeners?
No, I mean, all the books, you can find all the books on Amazon. I don't really have a website. I keep self-promotion to a minimum. So thank you for doing some promotion on my behalf. There are a bunch of TED Talks I've given that people might be interested in.
And you can find those on YouTube. And I'll put some links to some of Barry's books and TED Talks in the episode notes. Professor Barry Schwartz, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation, Zale, and I think you're asking really the most important questions.
Thank you so much. For Barry Schwartz, I'm Zale Mednick. Thanks for listening to Preconceived, and have a great day.